The Civil War began with a bang in 1861. Was the South really prepared to fight for independence? Its resolve would be tested in the conflict's first major battle. After the Battle of Fort Sumter in April 1861, the nation was embroiled in a civil war. Both the Union and the Confederacy rushed to mobilize. The capital of the Confederacy was moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, giving many Northerners the impression that the war could be ended swiftly by seizing Richmond. The two warring capitals, Richmond and Washington DC, were only 100 miles apart. The first major battle of the U.S. Civil War saw both sides relatively unprepared. Despite the advice of General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, Union President Abraham Lincoln caved to public pressure to attack quickly. Most of the Union forces were volunteers who had signed up for only 90 days. Famously, many Union civilians thought the war would be over quickly and even wanted to witness the battle. On July 21, 1861, a number of civilians, including congressmen and dignitaries, watched the battle and expected the rebels to turn tail and run. Instead of an expected quick victory, Union forces found themselves facing a more than equal force of Confederates, though both were similarly inexperienced and untrained. In their first major battle, both sides had similar-looking uniforms and insignias, creating confusion. However, the Confederates received reinforcements during the battle, turning the tide. Individual Union commanders also failed to press their advantages after winning skirmishes, giving the Southerners time to regroup. In the end, the Union Army retreated to Washington, D.C., with the exhausted Confederates unable to pursue them. On July 16, 1861, a Union Army led by General Irvin McDowell was prepared to end the rebellion against the United States. It marched out of Washington, D.C., and headed south toward the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. 2 days later, McDowell's troops neared Manassas, Virginia, and were eventually stopped by a stream known as Bull Run. On the other side of the stream waited a Confederate army under General P.G.T. Beauregard. Although McDowell's troops initially well outnumbered those of Beauregard, the Confederacy quickly sent reinforcements via railroad. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on July 21st, the Union Army began to march toward battle, with fighting commencing about 3 hours later. The Confederates used the new technology of signal flags to notify units of Union positions and prevent being overrun. By 10 a.m., the two sides were engaged in ferocious combat, and the Union forces scored some minor victories. However, Confederate reinforcements arrived, and troops were inspired by the valiant defense given by young General Thomas Jackson, giving him the nickname Stonewall. Confusion reigned, to the Confederates' benefit, when Union forces stopped firing in the mistaken belief that they were firing on their own troops. In the late afternoon following the mistaken friendly fire, Stonewall Jackson's troops charged forward while screaming, breaking the Union lines. The Union Army retreated that evening and returned to Washington, D.C. Although the Confederate Constitution was created in Montgomery, Alabama, in February 1861, before the Battle of Fort Sumter kicked off the Civil War, the city of Richmond, Virginia was chosen as the Confederate capital. The decision to place the capital in Virginia, and so close to the Union capital of Washington, D.C., was likely to inspire Virginians to fight hard for victory. Additionally, Richmond was the second largest city in the Confederacy and one of the few with an industrial base and a railroad hub. A final reason for the selection of Richmond was Virginia's historic role in the American Revolutionary War, giving some historical weight to the new Confederacy. Inevitably, choosing Richmond as the Confederate capital meant that the Union could attack it quickly from Washington, D.C. This was the goal of what became the First Battle of Bull Run: march in from D.C. and capture Richmond, thus ending the rebellion swiftly. President Abraham Lincoln was pressured into moving more quickly than following Winfield Scott's Anaconda plan of using a naval blockade to apply economic pressure to the South. Scott wanted to take time to train Union armies before striking the Confederacy, as well as focusing on the Western theater rather than concentrating the fighting close to Washington, D.C. During the First Battle of Bull Run, there was considerable confusion over who was who. Many Confederates wore blue, a common uniform color, and units' flags were similar. Only after the Civil War did the popular imagery of Union troops wearing dark blue and Confederate troops wearing light gray become ingrained in the public eye. Additionally, it was only after the first Bull Run that the Union settled on blue as its uniform color, with standardization across the board not occurring until the middle of the war. Due to economic struggles, the Confederacy was less successful at achieving standardized uniforms, with the gray dye often wearing out and giving uniforms a yellowish undertone. The Stars and Bars Confederate battle flag, often mistaken for the official flag of the Confederate States of America, was chosen by Confederate Generals Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard after the Battle of First Bull Run to avoid confusion with Union flags. The battle flag was designed by William Miles and formally presented to dignitaries in November 1861. However, it never achieved universal use and only achieved its iconic reputation after the war. The Confederate victory at the First Battle of Bull Run revealed that there would be no quick end to the rebellion. Having routed McDowell's army of northeastern Virginia, the South was emboldened to hold out and fight for independence. The North realized it would have to increase its mobilization and broad use of force. The South was not bluffing. This escalation would continue throughout the war, peaking in the autumn of 1864 after the Battle of Atlanta, when Union General William Tecumseh Sherman decided that total war was the only way to break the South's continued resistance. Intensifying the Union's combat efforts after the loss at First Bull Run largely fell to President Abraham Lincoln, who often felt early in the war that his generals were being too cautious. In January 1862, Lincoln issued General War Order No. 1, urging all land and naval forces to move against the Southern Rebellion. That spring, General George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac tried to capture Richmond a second time in the Peninsula Campaign, this time trying to go around Richmond and capture it from the south with a much larger force of fully trained Northerners.